And I would like to give the floor next to Adam Lupel, and maybe you could tell us a little bit how the major principles of multilateralism stand the test of the current conflict and involving a permanent member of a UNSC, which has breached most fundamental international norms. And how does the current standoff between Russia and NATO square with the claims that were made about the end of history and the triumph of peace and democracy after the dissolution of the USSR?
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I feel tremendously humble following Nadia on the front lines there. But I think maybe in response to your question, I think maybe my contribution can be to take a step back, look at the global system and how it's been impacted by the Russian aggression and the Security Council and all of that. So I'd like to focus my remarks a bit on what we call the crisis of multilateralism, which we broadly define in this context of rising geopolitical competition, decline in overall international cooperation, and a general perception that the international order is fragmenting, and that as a cause for some of the conflicts that we're seeing. And in many respects, the war in Ukraine is indeed a product of this broader crisis in the multilateral system. But of course, it's critically important to note, as we all know, that this crisis did not begin on February 24th. It is in fact a long-term result of the weakening of commitments to international law and the consistent violation of these fundamental norms on the use of force and human rights over at least more than a decade. And we've witnessed the increasing vulnerability of civilians in conflict contexts around the world as a result. At the International Peace Institute, where I work in New York, we've been following this debate around multilateralism for some time, and going back, I think, 5 years or so to the 2016-2019 context, where which was very prominent in conversations. Europe started the Alliance of Multilateralism in defense of the multilateral system. There was a lot of talk about this, about the crisis of multilateralism and the fragmenting of international order. And this often centered around fears of a rising tendency toward unilateralist nationalism and authoritarianism in the United States and elsewhere. But at the time, there seemed to be very little granular understanding of what exactly was happening, where the system was fragmenting, where it was strong, where it was weak, and really where it could be heading, looking ahead. So over the last 2 years, IPI, in partnership with the Institute for Economics and Peace, have been developing a research project, a multilateralism index, to better measure the course of the multilateral system and its impact on peace and security. Looking at the period between 2010 and 2020, looking at indicators of participation, performance, and inclusivity across 5 domains, including human rights. And I think that some of the early findings are relevant to this conversation that we've been having over the past day and a half. Some of them, I think, come as no surprise, but some are somewhat revealing. As is perhaps no surprise, in that period, 2010 to 2020, we see a general decline in the performance on human rights indicators around the world, and this has been noted by numerous speakers in the last day and a half. Indeed, according to Freedom House, civil and political rights have been on decline for every year for the past 16 years. In that same period, the index tracks an overall decline in measures of international peace and security. The number of countries globally that are not affected by state-based conflict reached its low in 2020. So this is not just about Ukraine, this is a global issue. This sort of comparison between human rights and peace and security, as an old political scientist. I do know that causation or correlation does not equal causation. But there is a relationship, and we do know that. Violations of human rights, especially when they correspond to exclusive political systems with state-led targets of discrimination, are a clear risk factor for increased organizational violence against civilians. And we also find that backsliding on democratic norms increases the risk of civil war. But this is maybe, we've been talking a lot about this, maybe this is obvious, but I think the revealing side, thinking about the multilateral system in this research, is that the data is actually not all bad for the multilateral system. While performance in the system is down across numerous indicators, participation in key parts of the multilateral system is up over the same period, including participation in the human rights architecture itself. And measurements of inclusivity are also up across the board, including on measures of civil society inclusion, public-private partnerships, and gender equality, all very important. So what does this tell us, and how does it bear on the current context that we're discussing? I think while we often tend to frame the crisis of international cooperation as one of the decrease of overall cooperation and a risk that rising populism, authoritarianism will lead to broad system exit and system collapse, what we are actually seeing is not a threat of forces leaving the multilateral system. What we are rather seeing is a battle over the nature and purpose of the system itself. It's not about just a decay of the order. The order is in transition, but it's unclear on transition to what. And the decisions being made today in Brussels and New York and around the world will be critically important for that future order. In part, this comes from a rebalancing of some of the pre-existing poles of the international order. We seldom kind of forget that the UN-based multilateral system has always been a hybrid system. It is both an aspirational system of norms and human rights and a pragmatic system of managed competition. In 2016, one might have been sort of forgiven for seeing this crisis of multilateralism as simply a challenge to the liberal international order, centered on debates between commitments to universal human rights and national state sovereignty. This remains important, but what the invasion of Ukraine reveals is the challenge to that normative order goes even deeper. The principles of non-aggression, inviolability of state borders, and limitations on the use of force, both on when and how and against whom it can be used, is where these two sides of the multilateral system meet: the aspirational, the principled, the normative, and the pragmatic. Because without adherence to these basic norms, we lose the very conditions for the possibility of the international rule of law. You have neither human rights nor managed competition. You are left with only might makes right and a recipe for endless war and human suffering. And it is these norms that are fundamentally under threat by the precedent set by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the future of human rights, I think, is at the core of all of this. It's a hard time to be an optimist. I confess I am an optimist, but it's difficult at times. But if I can end on one hopeful note, I think this has inspired citizens and governments, civil society, actors of all kinds, to wake up to a problem that has been coming for a long time. The threats to peace and democracy did not start on February 24th. They didn't start on January 6th in the United States. And they are not only coming from Russia. I think we've been talking quite a bit in the last day and a half about the need to take care of our own houses. And they've been coming for more than a decade. We are living in a polarized age, but my hopeful conclusion is that while the worst remain full of passionate intensity, the conviction of the best is rising. There's been considerable action in the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council here in Brussels, and capitals around the world to reinforce norms around the international rule of law in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. The bravery of the Ukrainian people, and I wish I could say this to Nadia in person, have really inspired us all. So briefly, to conclude, what needs to be done? We need to continue that work, to consistently protect those bedrock principles, to convince those who are, I think, regrettably called fence-sitters, to convince those that are fence-sitting, the non-aligned, who we should respect to remain non-aligned. We need to convince them that this is not about picking one side or another in a new Cold War. This is about ensuring the very possibility of maintaining international peace, and that is in the interest of everyone. And we need to focus on problem solving. The world is more independent than ever. Geopolitical competition does not elide the need for international cooperation to address many of the fundamental issues of our times. We've talked about some of these already: climate change, poverty, arms control, the pandemic. The list is quite long of things we need to work on. We need each other, and we can't forget that. Thank you.